Alright, hello again and welcome to another Kaijudo video. Today I am bringing a duel video between myself and KRICK once again. I will be piloting this Waterlight tempo deck, I guess you could call it. Very similar to the Alex Blue decks from back in the day. And KRICK will be piloting Light Water Dark Nature Control. So, to go over this list, basically just I wanted to play a bunch of Keeper of Laws for sure, so I splash in just a ton of Light Shield Blast. We'll see if I need all of them or not. It might be a bit on the clunky side, but I wanted to be able to consistently cast Keeper, so I decided to splash this heavier light package in. But I'm still playing a lot of the water stuff, focusing on Dendrite. You could go a different approach where you go even heavier on light, play Lyras. You could try Oathsworn Call as well, which is another build that I have built. Once you go to these extra 6-drop creatures instead of the evil evolutions like Dendrite, Oathsworn Call gets a lot more appealing, but Oathsworn's a bit of a clunky card, so it may just be better to play something like Arbiter that you might not play if you're going to go to Stormspark. So there's a lot of things to figure it out, but with this more blue-heavy version, I felt like this is a good starting place. Cetus the Augur is a card I'm trying out at the very least. I think it's a powerful card, definitely for certain matchups. Unfortunately, this matchup against Pile, it's not going to be the place to really keep an eye on how good it is and how effective it is against aggro, which is where it's really meant to be. But we can still keep an eye on it to see how big of a downside having this card is in this kind of matchup. If it's too big a deal to have this clunky multi-save that's mostly uncastable in a lot of spots, then we might have to cut it. But if it's not hurting us too bad, then we'll keep an eye on that. Some of the other stuff to go over, maybe a little bit light on 3-drops. With Corile and Neuron, we have a fair number. Cetus is really just not coming. You could technically play it on turn 3, but that's not really something that's going to be going on too often. But with Neuron and Corile, you do have a fair amount of turn 3 plays. But Neuron is not always going to line up that way. It doesn't really evolve off Cyberscamp in a fair number of matchups. There are another when you're talking about playing against aggro decks, then Neuron is a lot more consistent of a turn 3 play because you can pretty freely play it on top of a Cyberscamp. But in a matchup like this against the Pile, Neuron is a lot less of a 3-drop because it's only really coming down on turn 3 if you curve into it with like a Cyber Sprite or a Trader, which is still going to be a fair amount of the time, but it might hurt not having that 3-drop. Something like a Seneschal could fill that gap for us if we just have a copy or two, just to give us a standalone threat that doesn't require any bait or setup like Neuron does. But with that said, I didn't choose to play Seneschal just because I feel like overall the card's a bit on the underwhelming side. And even something like a Cyber Trader could just fill the gap on turn 3, like a second copy or maybe a Cyber Trader to follow up a Cyber Scamp. It's not ideal, it's not as good as playing a Seneschal, but it means we don't have to play Seneschal in our deck and we can still make plays. So I think that's all fine. Psychic Predator Rusalka was another card that you could include. I think Aqua Chaser is generally just a better card for the most part. You have a lot of things to do what Predator might be able to do either. You just have so much bounce stuff. I just don't think Predator is really necessary in terms of where it really shines is like locking down evolution creatures, but it can be effective, but I don't think it's necessary for this deck. We have 2 Cephalia, which is one of the cards. I did cut one Predator and the 3rd Cephalia to make room for these Cetus. We'll see if that really hurts us too, having the Cetus over something like Cephalia. I think the 3rd copy is probably too important to cut, just having that 5-drop to bridge the gap into something like a Finbar, especially when we're playing all these kind of anemic early drops. We really need this kind of card advantage to make that worthwhile, I think. So I think Cephalia is probably a card that should be at 3 for this list. But I just wanted to make some space and for 2 copies of Cetus to get a good feel for it. But again, this isn't really going to be the matchup where that's going to be too relevant. I think that's a good enough summary for this Waterlight Temple list. So we'll keep an eye on those things I mentioned. And going on to KRICK's side of things, the Light Water Dark Nature Pile list he's playing is right here. If it looks familiar, it is card for card David DiLorenzo's list that he used to top 8 the Open. I think it's just a great starting place for Pile. Pretty clean list. It's got a bunch of different things, a bunch of different tools that you could use for a number of matchups. You've got all the blockers, you've got Keeper of Laws, you've got the discard spells, you got removal. You got like the potent one-ofs like Skull Shatter, Mana Storm. You've got a very focused ramp plan with Sprout and Reap and Sow, and the Mana Storm like I mentioned. Even Full Metal Lemon for that. It's just got a lot of the pieces you would want. Now this version in particular, I don't think it's particularly well tuned to beat up on like the spell decks or the spell punishing cards like Cyber Scamp and Keeper of Laws. There's just so many spells in this deck, and it doesn't really have specific ways to address them outside of just drawing a bunch of these like early blockers. Like something like an Aqua Strider and Full Metal Lemon are really, really important for that. But you kind of even need to maybe pair that with something like a Piercing Judgment, which isn't always the best plan. So I feel like there may be some holes, but it's definitely a great starting place, and it's got a fair shot. This kind of list, this super clean list, is just going to give you a chance against almost everything. It's got a bunch of the different tools it needs. It's just a matter of kind of drawing the tools you need for each matchup and making sure you're playing to the tools that you need in each matchup as well. So between good draws and good piloting, it's got a chance against everything. So I really like this list, especially as a starting point for Pile. And KRICK as well, I believe he said this is one of the first matches he's actually played with a Haven deck. So it's something he wanted to try out, was experimenting with newer archetypes that he hasn't had much experience with, and getting out of his comfort zone a little bit from some of the decks he's used to playing. So we will keep an eye on how these matches play out. That should cover the decks. We will jump into the matches. So starting in game 1 here, I believe I won the die roll, so I have the choice of going first or second, and we will start things off. So my opening hand here, I have Cetus, a bunch of stuff. I should say, I went into this matchup with a bit of an unfair advantage. To be honest, I knew what deck KRICK was coming to the table with, and he didn't know what deck I was coming to the table with, which is probably something in hindsight I should have let him know just to balance out the playing field. But this is the kind of spot where in the dark against an unknown opponent, I would maybe keep the Cetus because it's so powerful against some of the aggro matchups, and I would want to figure out if it's going to be good or not before I put it down. But knowing that it's Pile, I just get the multi-civ out of the way right away, because if I do choose to speculate on the Cetus to see how valuable it's going to be, then I'm in a spot where if I want to cast this Cyber Scamp on turn 2, I'll probably have to mana one of these very powerful cards like Finbar or Dendrite, which I probably don't want to do if it ends up being the case that I'm playing against something like Pile. So a bit of an unfair edge there where I just get to make this mana choice super easily. But and then on the other hand here, KRICK's not going to have the same privilege. So in hindsight, I probably should have evened the playing field a little bit by letting him know. But at the same time, it's a good practice to learn sort of how to play these decks in the dark as well. You're not always going to have the privilege of knowing what your opponent's playing. And, I believe this was a spot KRICK mistakenly put down the Mana Storm. He meant to drag the Full Metal Lemon, which is why this card's tapped. So I think he makes the switch. But I actually believe the putting down the Lemon is a mistake. Now, it might seem like super biased because I know the matchup that's being played, but in general, I just think putting the Full Metal Lemon down, similar to what I was just talking about how I may speculate on putting that Cetus down in mana on my first turn. This is a spot where KRICK doesn't really know what deck I'm playing against. I mean, he has this one piece of information, but maybe we could discuss in a few moments what that means, but he doesn't know what I'm playing against. Let's just assume that for the most part, right? So I think Full Metal Lemon is the kind of card where the difference between how effective it is in the matchups where it's good and the matchups where it's bad is pretty big. So it's really important that you capture those points, or like the points you get from when it's good. You need to be capturing those points, right? So you need to get the most out of your cards. You need to get the most out of this Full Metal Lemon, and especially when it's a card that's so important to a lot of your plans and a lot of your draws against the aggro half of the metagame. So because of that, I think Full Metal Lemon is a card you should probably be speculating on a little bit. So waiting on making this mana decision. It seems like in this spot, the heuristic that KRICK is sort of following is to get the multi-civs out of your hand early, get rid of those tap lands so you don't have to deal with them as you're trying to develop your mana in a few turns down the road. But with a card like Full Metal Lemon in the dark, I think you just kind of need to wait a turn. Even if you break down this spot even further, there aren't really 2-drops that he has a pressing need to clear the way to cast by putting down this Full Metal Lemon either. Strider, Aqua Strider is one of the 2-drops he's playing, and there's no feasible way for him to cast that card on the following turn, given that he doesn't have another water source of mana. So you can discount that consideration entirely. And even when you look at something like Sprout, you don't need to necessarily cast a Sprout even on turn 2. If it turns out it's a matchup, if he gets another piece of information from my following mana decision that makes him want to put down this lemon, he can put that down, and if he draws a Sprout, he doesn't necessarily even have to cast that Sprout that turn. He can wait till turn 3 to cast a Sprout, and then he can curve Sprout into Mana Storm, into whatever. It doesn't have to come down exactly on turn 2, especially when it's maybe a slower matchup there where you want to cast a Sprout. And if it's an aggro matchup and you draw a Sprout, again, you'd much rather have this lemon in hand still that you can cast on turn 3 so that you can maybe mana something different on turn 2, play the Sprout, and then cast lemon on turn 3 and then do that sort of deal. So overall, I think the principle here is just you need to maximize what you get out of these cards, and I guess like the delta between Full Metal Lemon when it's good versus, or how much better it gets from in the matchups when it's good compared to when it's bad. You really need to capture those percentage points where you can. So just waiting to find out. I guess an even further point of discussion here is he does have like the Gloom Hollow to fill the role of the 3-drop blocker, so that's another part of what might have gone into this decision is like I can mana this Full Metal Lemon, get the multi-civ out of the way. If I need a blocker, I have the Gloom Hollow on backup duty to fill that role. So that's totally reasonable. I might, once again, I might be overblowing this because I know the matchup being played. I know that Gloom Hollow is a much less effective card in this matchup than Full Metal Lemon, so it may not be as clear. If he ended up playing against Mono Fire, the difference may not be quite as big. But in general, I think the play is still a mistake just because, like, in general, I just believe Full Metal Lemon is just a much stronger card than this Gloom Hollow anyways, especially in matchups. Like, any of the aggro matchups, most of them, I think Full Metal Lemon is just a much better card. It's much more important in your plans against something like Mono Nature midrange. It's much more important in your plans against this kind of water-based tempo deck. It's much more important against just a ton of decks, and it fills your ramp. Like, it's just a much better card in my opinion. So I think even though you have this Gloom Hollow to back it up, I still think it's a mistake to put this lemon down. But there's enough kind of things to make this decision that it makes sense that it was made. Like, I definitely don't fault KRICK for making this play. It totally makes sense. But I think in the dark, I think you should probably just throw down this Terror Pit for the most likely. Potentially this Gloom Hollow. Or maybe even the Haven. Any of these 3 cards I could see an argument for. Probably the Terror Pit most likely. And then here I just have the Scamp, so not much on my end. So, very long-winded explanation there, but I hope it kind of demonstrates some of the things to think about in the early turns. And now, with the Cyber Scamp play, I mean, this is kind of like the exact card that's, like Full Metal Lemon is the exact card you want to address something like Cyber Scamp. Which a lot of that's the other thing is, like, when I was running down that list of decks that are, where there's a difference between the two, like against any of these cheap creature aggro decks like Cyber Scamp decks, a lot of the tempo decks too, like, it's just so much more important to have a skirmish blocker than something like Gloom Hollow. So another thing too, that sort of what I touched on in the deck tech earlier was, I mean, this is the exact spot I was talking about where we just sort of miss our 3-drop because Neuron just isn't filling that role. And of note too, we have the Cetus. So if Cetus was something, the Cetus being our flex slot, if this was something like Seneschal, maybe we would have had a 3-drop to play as well, where we could have put in mana, maybe even put in mana this Neuron this turn and played a Seneschal if we had held this. But I don't know, the game would have played out a little bit differently. And this is another. This is, I think, a pretty clear mistake for the most part. I think I think I talked about this afterwards with KRICK, and it seemed like this was just a point where it came from a little bit of unfamiliarity playing with Cyberscamp, just not being familiar with kind of how this worked. But all that really happens is he basically just discards the piercing from his hand and lets me draw Cyberscamp. It doesn't actually impact any of my attacks the next turn. I just maintain the same board presence I did. I guess like maybe one of the arguments for it is like just to get the scamps out of my deck, but like if I wanted to keep my scamps in deck to like I could have just I just don't really see an argument. Like I'm just gonna take the extra resource and keep the body in play. Like going through the scamps quicker I don't think is super reasonable, because now like I went from having no play this turn to just getting to cast like an extra creature, which is not great, but like the piercing drew me this creature basically for no, and I didn't have to do any work for that. So I just think most of the time that's just going to be a mistake to make. Maybe it was like a super next level play where he just like offsets like a bunch of cards so that now this Cephalia gets worse because he gave me an extra resource and he gave himself one less resource. So now instead of having a bunch more cards in hand, like maybe that was like the next level play, but it was just probably a mistake. And this is also like this exact board state is, if this was a lemon here, it's just a much different board state because he's not facing any pressure from if he has lemon in play. But instead now I can just sort of, I mean, he's facing like they're both kind of weak to Rusalkas, of course, and things like that. But assuming I don't have those cards, I mean, Full Metal Lemon would just stop me from making any attacks because I just lose my whole board. But instead, this is a spot where I can just kind of attack liberally into the Gloom Hollow and break shields, put on pressure that way. So this Reapenso, I think I like this play. Like if you look at KRICK's hand, he's just got nothing going on. Like just a bunch of spells. It feels like this is the kind of spot where you just recognize that you're behind, you're up, you're going to be like there's a lot of different powerful plays I can make on my following turn. Whether I play Dendrite, return the Gloom Hollow, break a bunch of shields, whether I play something like a Rusalka, bounce the Gloom Hollow, break some shields, maybe less good than the Dendrite, but still a nice play. Whether I play Cephalia and draw a bunch of cards, there's a bunch of different things I could do on the following turn, and you're just falling further and further behind. So I think the Reapenso is just kind of a recognition that like you just need to suck it up and make some plays that play to like the game plan of this pile deck, which is just to get up in mana and try to Hail Mary and Andromeda survive and land a haven, right? Like it feels like that's kind of just, he's got to make it go with the game plan. On top of that, like if he high rolls and then this third scamp is in shields, he's in a very solid position. Not a great position still, but like it just makes him so much, he frees up his ability to, the knowledge of the ability to just start casting all these spells. Whereas if like I had this third scamp in shields and he's just foregoing doing anything to not let me get that third body, he's just going to fall further and further behind by default. So I think it's just totally a fine play to play to the odds of me having that scamp in shields, and also just play to his main game plan and just hope to get there with something like an Andromeda, because he, like again, he doesn't really have other lines of play really open to him. His hand is just all spells. He's going to have to do something into this scamp, so you might as well play the Reapenso. Like maybe you can wait to Mana Storm first, like to land a Mana Storm because it generates two mana, but like why not just Reapenso and then Mana Storm the next turn even? Like I think you just kind of got to do it. But it does suck for him that this is a Gloom Hollow, not a Lemon, and it does suck that I have the third scamp in my deck. But overall, I like the play that he made there. And like this is a spot where if he does have Shield Blast, like he's gonna be in decent shape. Like especially if I do something like break the first shield I break is a piercing, then like he's gonna be under. It's gonna mitigate some of the pressure he's under, especially this turn, and then he can get to good territory. Maybe make it that much more likely he survives to Andromeda. Of note, I could have played around Tendril Grasp. When he casts a Reapenso, I could have just not fetched a creature. Maybe this Reapenso was a signal. It's either a signal that his hand like sucks and he's just like I said, making that Hail Mary play, because he doesn't have any blockers to play. He doesn't have any interactive stuff to do that is creature based. So he just plays this Reap and Sow to dig for action that matters and get up in mana. It could be a signal that maybe he has Tendril Grasp that he's playing towards, so that might have been a consideration to play around that card, or even just to play around maybe like a Shield Blast Tendril Grasp here. But I think overall, like, another advantage I have in this matchup is not only do I know what deck he's playing, I know the exact list. So I know he only has one Tendril Grasp, so it's not a huge piece of information on my radar. But I just think, like, the point of leaving the Tendril Grasp in your deck for the most part, or leaving the Scamp in your deck for the most part, is just so that you can untap with some board presence after getting Tendril Grasp. But I'd rather just untap with that board position right now rather than wait to do it. Maybe that's incorrect because one of these creatures would untap with a Finbar coming down, as opposed to, if he does have the Tendril Grasp, I untap with no creatures and I play this Finbar, or one less creature and I play this Finbar. So maybe that's a consideration there. But I think it's just better to get the Scamp out now, break a bunch of shields. But I don't know. Maybe someone better than me would take issue with that play, but I think for the most part, I think it's fine to just fetch it out there and put on as much pressure as I can. I kind of get punished for it with the Bone Blades. Like, again, that could have been a spot where I just break 2 shields, and then he Bone Blades one of these, but I just still leave the Scamp in my deck, maybe. But it just feels like you're gonna have to pull it out at some time. Might as well just do it. Here. Interesting. So this was an interesting spot. So he untapped on 6 mana. So he very likely could have played Mana Storm, going up to 8 mana, right? And then, as long as he doesn't hit 2 multi-civs, like, he's going to be able to go Mana Storm plus Strider, and then he puts himself... It's like more likely that he gets the double ramp. So you could play Mana Storm to get to 8 mana, and then pretty much guarantee that you're going to be able to cast a Strider in the same turn. So you could do that. Or what you could do is go Sprout into Reap and Sow into play the Strider, and that would be better because you still get to 8 mana this turn, but you also get to look at one more card. You get a draw card, so that you can try to dig for something like Andromeda, which you're going to need to find. If it's not in the shields, you're going to need to find it in your deck. So giving you one more card to see Andromeda is really important, but the risk of going Sprout, Reap, and Sow is that you don't guarantee you draw the Strider, because if you hit, let's say you hit a multi-civ off this Sprout, which he did with the Reverberate, then all of a sudden when you go Sprout, if this is untapped, then when you cast this Reap and Sow, whatever he gets off the Reap and Sow could be untapped, and then he can play Strider, right? So is it worth it, right? Would you rather guarantee this Strider and play, again, I say guarantee, but it's if you hit double multi-civ off Mana Storm, it's not guaranteed, but would you rather take the higher likelihood of getting the Strider into play and getting to 8 mana versus the reduced likelihood that Strider ends up in play, but the greater likelihood, or the extra, you get to take the extra look at finding something like Andromeda. So that's the kind of balance there that play was making. Kind of tough to say which is correct, to be honest. Obviously, we see that he gets punished, but even if you Reap and Sow, if you see something like Andromeda plus multi-civ, I feel like you're kind of forced to take the Andromeda there, and then you're not playing the Strider anyway, so you kind of have to whiff multi-civ off both Sprout and Reap and Sow, almost in a sense. Like, if you're looking for something specific like Andromeda. I mean, that's not necessarily the case, like if you hit something, I guess that only really matters if you hit exactly Andromeda plus multi-save. Like you're still just digging through extra cards, you're getting a card deeper, and then maybe the card after that you wouldn't have gotten to otherwise would be Andromeda that you can draw next turn. So I don't know. I think probably worth it. Probably taking the risk to not get this Strider into play, just to get that extra look for Andromeda. I think that's probably correct. Just because, like, I mean, the Strider would be nice to have in play to insulate you a little bit from a Finbar, because then you still have this Gloom Hollow to block one of these creatures. But it's not like the Gloom Hollow, again, if this was a Lemon, it would be much different because it's actually killing one of these Cyber Scamps, and then on the next turn it can they can kill the second Cyber Scamp. So again, we're seeing how problematic it is that this Gloom Hollow isn't a Lemon. But it might be more of an issue to get that down. But if I don't have Finbar, or if I decide not to play Finbar, if you bend over backwards to get this Strider into play, I can just Piercing, bounce tap, and, well, not as good as maybe landing a Finbar on an empty board like this. The Piercing could still clear the way for me to get good attacks, get the Skirmisher off the board, and again kind of really embarrass the fact that this card is not Full Metal Lemon. So I think because Piercing Judgment can kind of Piercing Judgment can kind of invalidate this Aqua Strider. And even if if I just play Finbar and bounce the Strider, like, it's not too big of a difference whether or not he has this Gloom Hollow. Like, he might be able to untap with one more shield, right, with this Gloom Hollow blocking, but I'm still just drawing a bunch of cards off Finbar, breaking most of his shields anyways. I think so. Whether or not you keep this Gloom Hollow in play by playing this Strider to eat the bounce spell, I think it doesn't really make a huge difference. I think the biggest thing here is just digging for a card like Andromeda. I think that's probably the biggest thing you're trying to accomplish here. Because again, like, even if I have all these bounce things, if he just hits like a Piercing Judgment off the first shield, like, he's in good shape to untap and hit that Andromeda if he finds it, or untap and slam an Andromeda if he finds it, and then that can maybe get him into a decent position. So I think that's like the number one thing you're playing towards. So I actually do very much like this Reap and Sow Sprout play as opposed to Mana Storm. And then here I do just slam the Finbar, of course. Pretty easy play to make. And we will see. And yeah, so yeah, he found the Andromeda, which is like huge. So I mean, if he did make the other play, he probably would have just drawn this, or I don't know. Who knows? Like, maybe he would have just drawn this, maybe not. Maybe it would have been ramped into his mana zone. I don't know. But whatever. I break all his shields. He doesn't have any blasts, unfortunately for him. But he did hit the two earlier. He hit Bone Blades and Piercing. Unfortunately for him, they just didn't really come at opportune times. I mean, that's part of the variance too, is you can have Piercing and shields, but it's not going to be good if it's the first shield you throw down in the face, or that gets broken in the face of a Cyber Scamp. So if that Piercing was later down the line, and in one of these later shields, he would have been in a much better position. But as it is now, he's pretty much, like, I have infinite cards in hand, a ton of pressure on board. He's just in tough shape. So yeah. Yeah, and we did see he mistakenly put the shield in face up, but break this one anyways, so like I would naturally just break from right to left just in case. Act like I didn't see that. I could have played Dendrite to play around like double Stormspark, but yeah, that was game one. So overall, from that game, I really liked KRICK's decisions there with the just go on the ramp plan and try to do something of. He gave himself the best chance he could. He gave himself the chance to have a timely shield blast. He gave himself the chance to play an Andromeda and potentially survive with it. So I feel like he did everything in his power that he really could, aside from like the mistakes with the Lemon mana decision, which, to be honest, may or may not be a mistake depending on how you approach like the early turns of the game. And then the the Piercing Judgment Shield Blast as well. Like aside from those two, what I perceive to be mistakes at least, I think the rest of the game, I think he did a good job of identifying the plans. From my side, I mean, everything was pretty straightforward. I just landed a Cyber Scamp. We didn't really see too much go wrong for me. I missed my 3-drop, and then all I did was play the Scamp on turn 4, which was aided by the fact that KRICK basically put it in my hand, which was lucky. But I don't know. That was a spot where having stuff like Cetus in my deck didn't really appear to hurt too much, just because like the rest of the deck is well positioned enough in this matchup that maybe I don't really care for that card to be something like a Seneschal, but or even another 5-drop like Cephalia. But we'll see if that remains true. And we'll jump into the second game here. So KRICK leads on Reverberate. Similar kind of heuristic to just get the multi-civs out of the way. And of course, unlike the previous game, this is one where he actually knows the matchup now, and Reverberate's not going to be a high value card. On top of that, it also lets him cast an Aqua Strider should he draw one this turn, which is going to be really important. And on my side, I mean, I opened triple Storm Spark, which doesn't look very good. I've got these clunky 5-drops, but so my opening hand kind of sucked. But I mean, that's why I generally tend to think like the opening hand's not going to matter too much. Like, you only need one half of your cards to be live, and the other half can be bricks to cast the good half. And luckily, I draw one of the best cards in my deck, so that was very nice to see. Probably the best card I could have drawn over the first 2 turns. Drawing Cetus kind of sucked there, because drawing that multi-civ, if it was just another untapped water mana, we could have just put it down to cast one of these. But then again, I mean, if this was a card like Seneschal, maybe we wouldn't put it down. And KRICK here is just kind of throwing his spells down again. Not really in a position to hold this Mesmerize to cast it should he draw another Darkness card. And I mean, this is kind of the exact same as the first game, where this Cetus, if it was like a Seneschal, it would look much better for this matchup. But with already having Cyber Scamp and Keeper of Laws to follow up, like, do we really need the Seneschal to add to this draw? I mean, it would be nice, but we probably don't. And here he plays Keeper of Laws. Makes sense. It's kind of the play you have to make. Does a good job contesting the Cyber Scamp, but yeah. So yeah, I'm just feeling pretty good about my position. Even if he has something to out this Keeper of Laws, like a Piercing Judgment, like he's trading off, and I get a draw card and untap with 2 Cyber Scamps. So I'm feeling good about that. Throws down Tendril, casts Mana Storm. So I think this is one of the pivotal turns of the game here. I think KRICK hasn't really had too many decisions so far, but unfortunately not the best draw for him. Hasn't seen any of the good cards he would need, like the Skirmish Blockers. But this is the key decision point, I think, in this game so far, where it feels like he's sort of following the same principle he did in the previous game, where you're just kind of recognizing, like, look, I'm facing down these spell punishing creatures. Like, I gotta just, at some point, I gotta suck it up and do something and just try to play to the core game plan of my deck, try to land an Andromeda Survive. That whole thing I talked about in the previous game. It seems like he's following that same line of thought here. But the difference between the previous game and this game is, in the previous game, his hand was just 4 spell cards that weren't doing anything. It was a Crystal Memory, a Sprout, Mana Storm, and the Reap and Sow, like just all sort of random mess of spells that he can't really do much anyway. So he sort of felt forced into that decision. This time, I mean, he's got double Lyra here, so it's a completely different conversation, because he's got a creature plan that he can pursue in the face of these spell punishing creatures. So I think there's a lot more thought that can go into this play here, where I mean, he could just pass on turn 5 here, which does kind of suck, because if I just play something like a Rusalka, bounce this Keeper, I can break a few shields, chip in for a few shields, and he's definitely falling behind. And then he could play a Lyra, maybe tap my Cyber Scamp. Then on my turn, I mean, if I have something like Finbar, he's going to be in a really tough shape, because I just bounced the Lyra, break another 2 shields, and then he's just falling further and further behind. So, I mean, it feels like he's definitely on the back foot no matter what, especially when he's just going to skip his turn 5 here, if he was to go for a Lyra line instead. But I think honestly, like that might be his better chance to win, just because I think ultimately what it comes down to for me is, again, I think no matter what, he's going to be sort of at the mercy of the cards in my hand, and it's really going to come down to whether or not I have the powerful follow-ups to really put him in the dirt, I guess. But the difference between these two plays is Mana Storm, it almost, like, you're hoping I don't have the cards that'll bury you, and Mana Storm, because it's a spell, it basically gives me the cards that are going to bury him. So it's almost like you're kind of determining you're just kind of signing off to your fate when you do that, because you give me the extra creature in play, you give me the extra card in hand. Whereas with Lyra, you play a creature that can test my board, and then you force me to have an answer to that Lyra, right? If I don't have an answer to that Lyra, it's going to be a lot closer of a game. It's going to be a close game. Now, with 3 cards in hand and cards coming off the top of my deck in the next couple turns, not super likely that that's going to happen, that this Lyra goes uncontested, but it's probably more likely than you just Mana Storm, give me a bunch of extra resources, and then somehow from that position I don't have anything else. Because either way, whatever I play is going to be good. But the Lyra forces me to have something, whereas Mana Storm doesn't necessarily force me to have something, and it also gives me something. So I think it's just a little bit worse of a play. Mana Storm definitely does a better job playing to that Andromeda game plan, but I feel like that's without Andromeda in your hand here, without ways to dig for Andromeda, like I feel like that's not really something you can really afford to do in this spot, unfortunately. I think what I would do is definitely keep the Mana Storm in my hand, because you're going to need, like, especially if you're deploying these creatures and trying to protect your shields, you're going to need a card like Mana Storm probably in a few turns from now to generate the extra mana to get up to something like Andromeda, or a second Haven if you find one. But I think what I would do is just mana this Haven and pass, and then hope I don't have a good play. Maybe break a couple shields, give him a few cards if I remove this Laws. Then I would probably like throw down the Laws and mana, play the Lyra, tap down this this Cyber Scamp, try to get the Cyber Scamp off the board, and then maybe from there I might have to stabilize the board with my second Lyra, or if things really go my way from the perspective of the control player, maybe I do stabilize with these Lyras, and then I can just resolve this Mana Storm uncontested, or even if it gives my opponent a draw off their Keeper of Laws. As long as they're not developing free boards presence out of this Cyber Scamp, if I have a couple Lyras in play and maybe 2 shields at least, and then I can kind of almost more freely play this Mana Storm after sort of stabilizing the board a bit. And then that way, because without any traction playing to this Mana Storm line, you're just giving your opponents like everything they could really ask for, and you're not gaining traction on the board. So I think you have the option to gain traction with these Lyras, and I feel like you just need to play to that. Now, again, I think both lines are really at the mercy of my hand. So, I mean, you are maybe an underdog either way. We could be talking about a situation where the Mana Storm line is like 20% to win, the Lyra line is 30% to win. Maybe there's a bigger gap, maybe there's a closer gap than that, maybe it's even less likely than that, maybe it's more likely. I don't know exactly how to do that, but I would assume that the Lyra line is going to be a little bit more likely, if not a lot more likely to win. But I think in both cases, he's probably losing this game. Like, no matter what, I think he's less than 50% to win this game, but I think Lyra is the higher line than this Mana Storm. Definitely a lot going into this position. I'd love to hear other people's takes on this, but from my perspective, I think, again, I like that KRICK is thinking this way, where you're kind of just recognizing positions where you sort of have to suck it up and play to the plan, hope the opponent doesn't have it. But I think in this specific instance, unlike the previous game, he has other options to consider before consigning himself to that kind of fate. So, interesting position. We'll see how it plays out from here. But yeah, we'll see me. I mean, I get to draw an extra card and get the Cyber Scamp. Yeah. Like, yeah, that's just the thing about that is, like, I mean, it also just makes my Dendrite live. Like, that's another thing to consider too, is like, in this, like if he just passes, I could Dendrite this Keeper of Laws back and break a bunch of shields, but then I'm losing my Cyber Scamp in play to insulate me from spells and Shield Blast spells in particular. And then like imagine if I go for that line, like, well, I wouldn't go for that line, to be honest. I wouldn't make that play. But if I did something like Dendrite, bounce this Keeper of Laws, break a bunch of shields, if I hit Terror Pit and then I lose my Dendrite and then my Keeper of Laws is tapped, he can untap, play Lyra, tap down the Keeper of Laws, and then I just lose the game. So, I mean, I probably wouldn't make that Dendrite play, but even if I just go, like my hand wasn't really set up, so that was a situation where I kind of had the weak hand that he would hope to play towards by playing these Lyras. So like I would probably just pass. Like I would have just maybe, like I would have drawn this Cyber Lord Corile, maybe played it and then pass, and then he could untap, play Lyra, tap down the Cyber Scamp, kill it with Laws, and then I'm untapping with like 2 guys, and my Dendrite's like not super good in the face of Lyra. He can play second Lyra the next turn and tap down the Dendrite if I had attacked with it. Like I think he's in pretty good shape. Just because, I mean, my hand was kind of like the little bit on the clunky side. But now he just makes my Dendrite super live. I get to play it, bounce the Keeper of Laws, and break a bunch of shields. And now he's super on the back foot. I have this extra body in play that probably shouldn't have been there. And he hits a Bottle of Wishes. So, I mean, he may be able to just steal a win here with Bottle into Andromeda. Just let that card do all the work for him. But we'll see. We will see. Lots of shuffling going on. And Stormspark. So, I mean, it's good in the sense that it saves his other 2 shields, which is good, but I mean, even if you're not hitting something like a Lyra, or sorry, an Andromeda, or a Haven, or even a Cassiopeia, even if you're not hitting one of those big cards, it would be nice to just hit like an Aqua Strider or a Full Metal Lemon, because those would also just halt my attacks pretty well. And at least, and it's also like just a card in play that could block this Dendrite the following turn. So it would have just been nice. But instead he hit Stormspark, which is, I mean, it's, again, like, it stops my attacks, which is good for him, but it also is just probably the worst way you could go about doing that off of the bottle, because I just get that 3rd Scamp in play, I draw an extra card. And of note, like, there's no reason to play around things like Tendril Grasp when he only has a 1 in mana. So now he plays the Lyra, but feels like too little too late here. I just get to use Corile, set up my shield with the Stormspark, and then play my Neuron. And this is a spot, unless he has Piercing Judgment off the, or no, he can't, no, there's literally no way he can survive, sorry. Sorry, what am I saying? If he has Piercing Judgment off the first shield, he could like bounce tap these Cyber Scamps. But if not Piercing on the first shield, he's just dead. Again, all the mass removal is gone. He has Tendril Grasp, he has Stormspark, and the second Stormspark in the list, which I know he's playing, is down here. And even the bottle is gone too. So there's no Shield Blast that can save him in this spot. And flips up a Crystal Memory. So that is the game. So I think both games definitely played out well for me. I had the turn 2 Scamp both games especially game 2, my draw looked really clunky, especially my opening triple Stormspark Blast and a couple 5-drops, but I drew Cyber Scamp and we saw how much of an impact that card had on the game. So, I mean, yeah, just definitely a tough matchup to play from the pile side. Definitely not one it's going to be favored in for sure, and we really saw them on the back foot. Like, KRICK was basically on the back foot the whole game, especially given that I drew the most important cards in my deck for the matchup. And on top of that, KRICK really only saw like one skirmish blocker across both games. I mean, this Lemon came in off a Mana Storm. In game 2, he saw an Aqua Strider, but he never really got the chance to play it. because it came down way too late into his hand. The only blocker he probably realistically had a chance to play, at least as far as skirmish blockers are concerned. Sorry to diss on Gloom Hollow. The only real blocker he really drew was in game 1, and that was the crucial Full Metal Lemon that ended up in his mana zone, and that had a lot of kind of rippling implications with how the matchup played in that game, especially because I didn't draw my draw didn't have the Rusalkas. And in the game, like I said, in the games where like I'm not having Rusalka, there's a big difference between Full Metal Lemon and Scared Orbital. If I do have that Rusalka, I mean they're both the same card, right? It's just 3 mana blocker that's in my hand and not on the board. It doesn't really matter what the difference between them is. And in that spot, Gloom Hollow is even better because it's an untapped mana source. But when I don't draw the Rusalkas, like something like Lemon just holds the fort down so much better as a skirmish blocker that can actually kill creatures compared to Gloom Hollow. So we really saw that for turn 1 mana decision having rippling implications across the whole game. With that said, I mean, again, I just need to caveat that I may be operating with too much bias there when I make that analysis about how Full Metal Lemon is so much better than Gloom Hollow and all that, just because like I saw how the games played out. I saw the matchup, like all that kind of stuff. So maybe take it with a grain of salt, but I still think there's a lot to learn there, just with the principle of recognizing the power of certain cards for certain matchups, especially when you're facing an unknown opponent, and making sure you're evaluating your opening hand correctly. A good example of that, I should say too, with the turn 1 Reverberate mana decision this game. If that was game 1, you wouldn't make that play. Despite Reverberate being one of the play that unlocks a Aqua Strider off the top of your deck, Reverberate is just such a potent one of. Like, it's just a super crucial one of in a ton of different matchups. You can't afford to put it in your mana zone on turn 1. So in that spot, when you're playing an unknown opponent, you would keep the Mana Storm, or you would keep the Reverberate. And I think that's an even better way to depict that idea than the Full Metal Lemon, just because I think it's a lot more clear cut that Reverberate is so much better in certain scenarios than it is in others, and you really need to make sure you have access to Reverberate for those certain scenarios. Once you find out it's not going to be good, you can throw it in mana, but even with the implication that it can cast like a top decked Aqua Strider, you should hold that Reverberate in your hand, in my opinion, at the very least. So, a bunch of different things to learn from that match. Hope everyone enjoyed the analysis. As always, thank you for watching the video, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.